select recording, and then we'll begin. All right, hello everyone. Gotta say, happy May the 4th, right? Today's May the 4th. Welcome to our second in a series on emerging topics in ITSM. We're privileged to have as our guest, Mark Smalley. Mark is a prolific author and presenter. His many publications include contributing author to the ITIL 4 book, High Velocity IT. Personally must have a reading. He's a highly sought after international speaker and is very active on social media. He considers himself the IT paradigmologist, which is really a fancy way of saying he's devoted his life to thinking, speaking, and writing about IT paradigms. The presentation will last about 40 to 50 minutes with time left over at the end for Q&A. We will be holding the Q&A until the end. Everyone will be on mute. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. Use the chat to talk to each other. The webinar is being recorded. The deck, the transcripts, the recording, and anything else related to this event will be sent to you via email within 5 business days and posted on the EDUCAUSE ITSM website. All right, without further ado, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks everybody for showing some interest in this topic. That crazy job title of mine, the IT paradigmologist, study of paradigms, that fits in fairly neatly with this presentation, because what I'd like to do is share with you how people are looking at the more digitally driven or digitally enabled organizations that place high demands on the IT function. They're adopting different ways of thinking, different ways of working. I'd like to share what seems to be going on, at least what they say they're doing, in the hope that it might stimulate your thinking, act as a bit of a catalyst to stimulate some thoughts. Food for thought is not comprehensive. It's certainly not prescriptive. I think you've got to work out for yourself what's going to fit in your organization. I think I'll refer back to that concept quite a lot. The fact that things are very contextual, and feel free to disagree, because then I might learn something as well. I hope we might have some conversation at the end. I'm aiming to get at least 5 minutes of Q&A, and if we aren't able to deal with all of the questions, I'll be happy to follow up by responding in writing, something that Mitch will share with you. So let's see what happens. Good. Now, what I have in mind for this session, 4 agenda items, but it's really in 3 parts. Firstly, very briefly, reminding us of probably what you're noticing yourselves, various drivers affecting the IT service management world. Looking at trends, seeing what people seem to be doing, some more than others. And then the body of the presentation will be on ways of thinking and ways of working, loosely based on ITIL 4 High Velocity IT, where I was the lead editor of that publication, and closely aligned with the concept of an IT operating model, which I find quite useful to join the 2 up, because it's about understanding which changes to make in your way of working in order to fulfill these higher demands better. In terms of learning objectives for this 3/4 of an hour or so, I'd like to think about learning objectives not only in terms of knowledge, but also beliefs, abilities, and even feelings. The knowledge side is really what's on the agenda, drivers of change, trends, and the different ways of working connected to the IT operating model. Some interesting beliefs that you might, well, I certainly share with you. Whether you adopt the beliefs is up to you, but I think this seems to be a bit of a step change for many organizations, a significantly different way of working, different way of thinking about things, particularly the inherent unpredictability of the complex adaptive systems that we seem to find ourselves in. And that refers to the second belief here. In complex systems where behavior just emerges, it's futile to have a grand plan. because it won't happen. It's more a question of moving from where you are than moving to an idealized end state, which probably isn't going to happen anyway. Things happen on the journey. We'll be referring to best practices from time to time. They can't emphasize this enough. They do very much depend on the context that you apply them in. And even an organization that proudly presents at a conference, for instance, a best practice that has worked for them, it's questionable whether it would work for them again half a year later or a year later, because their circumstances have changed. So that's another belief that I believe to be true. And finally, value from service is phenomenological. It's unique, it's subjective, it's individual, it's about the experience. And when we talk about service, IT service management, really crucial to realize that it's about the experience, how people perceive the service. What will you be able to do after an hour's webinar? Well, not much, to be honest. I can point you in the direction of things that you might not have noticed already. I can possibly give you different perspectives on familiar things. I can certainly give you some sources to follow up if you're interested in this kind of stuff, because we'll be going through the content pretty briefly. I want to give you an overview of various topics that I think are relevant. If you think they're relevant, then you can dive into them further, and I'll be happy to help you out with that if you need additional sources. And finally, how will you feel after the presentation? Hopefully inspired to explore one or two topics, possibly apprehensive of the change if it seems significant for your organization, but reassured that lots of people are struggling with this change. And particularly one of the key concepts that we'll be touching on, how do you organize, how did the whole idea of teams, how many teams do you need, how should they be organized, what size? That's really a key topic that people are struggling with. But I hope at least I'll leave you with the confidence that some change is feasible, taking things step by step. So that's those are learning objectives. Firstly, very quickly, drivers of change, the things that I tend to think about that are affecting the world, the increasing economic and societal impact of technology. Think about how the pandemic would have been without the kind of technology that we have. Really significant how that influenced our survival, basically. So that's first point, increasing impact of technology. The ethical impact is another one, might touch on that later. The increasing complexity of systems, so many variables that interact, you can't find a root cause. Things just happen. And you have to learn to deal with that uncertainty. Working with complexity is a key topic. One of the most fundamental topics in the ITIL 4 High Velocity IT book. Technological progress, of course, the shift to cloud services, for instance, the application of machine learning, things like chatbots, AI, chatbots, sorry. And finally, I think pretty significantly, the different approaches that adjacent domains within IT are adopting. Significantly, the agile movement, developers more often than not, apply agile methodologies, and DevOps, for instance, as well. And that affects us, I think, in two ways. Firstly, we have to learn to collaborate with other teams that work in different ways. That's the first one. Secondly, I think we have a lot to learn from different ways of working. And that was one of the major topics in the High Velocity IT book, to look at lean, agile, resilient, and continuous ways of working and see how we could adapt those in the IT service management context. Mitch, let's get our first poll. We'll be having 3 polls during this presentation. This is the first one. Let's get this one up.
Absolutely.
What I'd like to ask you is the kind of value that your organization gets from digital technology. three choices: doing things more efficiently, which is the traditional way of using technology, or doing things in the business significantly differently because technology enables you to do that, or doing significantly different things, for instance, digital products and services. So how would you say, and by the way, Mitch, I can see the poll, just for your information, which of these characterizes the bulk of the value that you think your organization gets out of digital technology?
We're about like 56% participation, so we'll leave it up for just a couple seconds, few more seconds to give you time to answer. Looks like doing things more efficiently is topping the respondents' responses. Yeah. And we'll just give it 5 more seconds here. We're at 83% participation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll here.
Yep.
And then I'll share results.
Oh yeah, can see them. Yeah. 62, 18, and 20. So the majority doing we're really the traditional way. You've probably been doing it for years and are still doing it. And in addition to that, you're using technology for other purposes. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, I'll go ahead and stop sharing the poll results then.
Yeah, right. Moving on to the second of the first two fairly quick agenda points, trends in the broader IT service management space. Those of you who are familiar with ITIL 4 may recognize the 4 dimensions of service management that I've used to organize a number of trends that I'll be sharing. But it's not, if you're not familiar with ITIL 4, it doesn't make much difference. First set of trends to share is the shift from project to product. You might be familiar with Mick Kirsten's book, Project to Product. It's about the shift from large, as a way of organizing work, large temporary projects to smaller, more permanent project-based teams. Seeing that quite a lot. That usually goes hand in hand with the shift from specialized job roles to more multifunctional job roles, which are often referred to as T-shaped or pie-shaped. That's the Greek pie, not the edible pie, or comb-shaped with lots of prongs, comb-shaped job profiles where people have multiple skills. So you've got a pretty small, compact product team, and with lots of people who can do lots of things. That's a pretty major shift. Secondly, unsurprisingly, the shift from on-premises infrastructure to more cloud-based services, from monolithic applications to more loosely coupled application architectures, often based on microservices. Thirdly, the shift, and this also applies not only to the services that you acquire from partners and suppliers, but also to the services that you provide to your service recipients. The shift from traditionally output-based service quality and service level agreements to also include business impact and outcome and experience. And you may have come across the term XLA, experience level agreement, which you can see as not as a replacement for SLAs, but a natural extension to also include business impact, outcome, experience. And this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, the shift from order takers to dictators, but there's more than a grain of truth in there. I'm thinking in particular about the large service, cloud service providers who simply dictate their terms and conditions to the market. Now, you don't negotiate with AWS about their service levels. You pick the flavor that you want, and that's that. And I was joking with my ITIL colleagues that we should have a practice service dictator management to learn how to deal with these kind of providers. And in fact, one of the new ITIL publications, the Acquiring and Managing Cloud Services, is really about that area. And of course, it's not as if the other kind of providers have disappeared. It's just that we have this category as well. So it stipulates the heterogeneous character of the supplier landscape. We're dealing with a multitude of different kind of suppliers, and you might like to think about the SIAM framework, service integration and management, because that framework gives pretty decent guidance how to deal with such with a diverse supplier landscape. Finally, on the topic of value streams and processes, the shift from functional silos, which is a very traditional, very common way of organizing work, to more end-to-end value streams, and different ways of working, the shift from, in the development area, more from waterfall to agile. And in general, you could say the shift from linear approaches, where you can predict things and where there's a root cause, to more emergent approaches. And we'll be dwelling on that, that later. Now, not comprehensive, but these are common trends you may have come across. The trouble is, certainly when you're presented with these two columns, they're often presented with either the explicit or implicit message that the ways on the left are evil, the old ways of working, and the ways on the right are sacred, or the other way around. But this is not helpful. This is a false dichotomy. As I said at the beginning, it's all contextual. So you do really need to think about your own organization. And for instance, you can have a perfectly good motivation for choosing certain specialized roles. If, for instance, in product-based teams, you don't have enough work to justify a particular expert, you might need to bundle that expertise and have people in a shared service center so you can share them across teams. That might be the case. Waterfall is perfectly acceptable if you fulfill a number of requirements, if you know the requirements, if they're not going to change much, if you know how many resources you need, how many people you need, if you know the kind of approach you're going to take, waterfall will be fine. So do take these trends with old and new with a big pinch of salt, and try and work out what fits in your organization. Right, on to the second poll, please, Mitch. Thinking about the weakest link in your organization, and therefore what should be your highest improvement priority. And I'll talk you through the 6 options. The first one being valuable investments. Are you doing are you doing the right thing? Are you automating the right business processes? Are you developing the right digital products and services? It is really about is the functionality effective for your organization? Are you doing it quickly, both developing and delivering the functionality? Are the resulting IT systems resilient enough to ensure undisrupted business operations? Fourth one's an interesting one. The concept of co-creation of value, realizing that the IT service provider doesn't create value, it's the users that actually create the value by applying the technology in their business context. And so this is, it takes 2 to tango. So this is about the intimate dance between service provider and service recipient to actually get the business outcomes. Fifthly, are you concerned about assuring conformance to whatever governance, risk, and compliance requirements apply to your organization or your industry or your country? And finally, are you concerned with the affordability of the IT solutions, the efficiency in terms of cost and effort? So those are your 6 choices. Which would you say is your weakest link and therefore your highest improvement priority?
We'll give this poll a few more minutes. We're at about 60% participation, so or a few more
it's the most complex. It's the most complex of the 3.
I imagine people are thinking through these in their own organization.
Yeah, and they're interesting questions to think about, independent of this this poll in the presentation. Yeah, but what's your biggest problem?
And we're right about 75% participation. Give it maybe 5 more seconds. Give you a chance to add your response. And looking at all these, it's like these are all our weakest links and all the opportunities that we have. So.
Yeah, well, you have the ability to break a trend. So I'll be interested. I've done plenty of these polls before, and I'll show you the results in a minute. I hope you don't break the trend, but on the other hand, it might be interesting.
I think we're at a good number here. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
Good. Let's see.
And I'll share the results.
The trend is broken.
With the higher ed.
That's good. Let's see. So we've got 10, 32, 15, 24. Nobody for a short conformance. That's not a surprise. Right. What I'll do now, thank you so much for sharing that. It's valuable input. These are the results of previous polls that I've done in similar settings, either live, real physical conferences or online. And up until now, the highest priority was co-creation of value between the service provider and the service consumer. You've broken the trend by putting what has been the second place, pretty consistently the second place on average, fast development and fast delivery as your highest priority. But as you said, Mitch, it's sort of fairly close. And interestingly, a fair number of people who are concerned with the efficiency of the solution. That's but it's not exceptional what you shared there. Okay, great. Thanks for that. I'll by the way, I'll incorporate all of the poll results in a new version of the slide deck, which I'll share with Mitch to share with you, so you can reflect back on the results. But these are certainly interesting questions to discuss with your colleagues. What is your perception of the weakest link? Right, on to the final part and the biggest part of the presentation, looking at different ways of working, different ways of thinking about IT service management, loosely based on ITIL, high velocity IT, and related to the concept of the IT operating model, which is not a standardized notion. People have different opinions about what an IT operating model is. So I'd like to dwell on that for a moment, just to clarify it. But first, a very brief introduction of myself by way of the publications that I've been involved with, referring now to high velocity IT, where I wrote about half of the book, and I engaged 21 authors to write specialized parts for the other half of the book. Turned out quite nicely. I even got a t-shirt made with a book on it. Madder than that, I wrote a book about the book. Crazy. Reflections on high velocity IT that you can buy on Amazon for about $10. But in fact, it's $987 because that's a Fibonacci number, which you can see reflected on the pattern on the cover. That's how crazy I am. I've written some more for Axelos about high velocity IT. Axelos is the owner of ITIL, contributed to other ITIL publications. I don't, in fact, have an ITIL Foundation certificate. So you could say I'm the least well qualified person to write an ITIL book, but I think that's possibly why they engaged me, because I look at things possibly from an outside-in perspective. Been involved in other bodies of knowledge as well. COBIT, Verism, IT for IT, did a fair bit for them. And if you are not aware of the digital practitioner body of knowledge, second on the right from the top, that's quite a fabulous work. Charlie Betts, currently an analyst at Forrester, that's his magnum opus. It's really a great work. And I've written a couple of other books. I'm building a series of what I call reflections books. And if you're interested in stuff that I've contributed to, look at my website, smalley.it, on the writing page, where I've got links to various stuff. Some of the white papers are free of charge. Others are books which are commercially available. So that's a bit about me by way of the content I've been involved with. Now, looking at high velocity IT, I'm going to run you through it pretty quickly, stopping from time to time at I think, interesting parts. Following the table of contents of the book, 5 chapters, starting with the introduction. Patrick Dubois, you might know the name as his name as the father of DevOps, the guy who came up with the term DevOps and who organized the first DevOps Days conference. He was kind enough to write the foreword of the study and reference guide, and he called it an exploration framework, which I thought was really spot on. It intended to help you explore this domain and see what people are doing, how they're responding to the higher demands that digitally driven, digitally enabled organizations place on the IT function. And the intent is to help people discuss digital, whatever that is for you, more confidently, and to integrate new ways of thinking and new ways of working into their practices. So that's really that's the intent of the book. Chapter 2 deals with the key concepts. What is digital technology? How does it differ from IT technology, for instance, from information technology? What's digital transformation? How does it differ from IT transformation? Stuff like that. But the last part of this is a pretty big part of chapter 2, and that's, you could say, that's about the ITIL operating model, at least in the high velocity IT context. So I'd like to talk about that a bit. Models of reality. Let's just introduce the topic, suggesting that this represents our way of working. It's a model. It's simplistic. We do this, we do this, we do this. It's our way of working that's based on some kind of a framework. It could be ITIL, it could be IT for IT, it could be anything else. And then we've got, so you could say that's a frame of reference or a meta model. And then we've got reality, how we actually work. And not intended as a disqualification of reality, because this is simply how reality is, but just to emphasize that a model is an imperfect simplification of reality intended to make a certain point, focus your intention on more important things at the cost of ignoring less important things. And you could say it's a sequence of architecture, design, and product. So a model is just a model. Now, I'd like to introduce IT operating models in 3 stages. First, talking about what's a business model, then what's an operating model in general, and then what's an IT operating model and how the two connected. You might have come across this before. It's the business model canvas. The reference is that book on the left, where the value proposition, the products and services of an organization is in the middle of the framework of the model, the canvas, with on the right-hand side, the marketplace, the customers, the channels by which customers interact with you, and the relationships that you have with your customers and they have with you. And on the left-hand side, the things you need to create and deliver the value propositions, the key activities, resources, and partners. And it's finished off with revenue and cost. A guy called Andrew Campbell, who wrote a fabulous book, got it here, really excellent book, wonderful, it's a random page, wonderful illustrations, very colorful, illustrative book. He said you could look at the business model canvas as a front end, a middle, and a back end, with the back end really being the operating model within the business model, the operating model within the business model. And he said this idea of activities, resources, and partners, that's fine, but if you refine it a little bit more, and he refines it in SES components, SES element, he calls them elements, SES element, six elements. He abbreviates the elements as POLISM: processes and value chains, organization and people, locations and assets, things like buildings, manufacturing machinery, information and technology, suppliers and partners, and an underlying management system to manage both performance and improvement. That's his interpretation of an operating model. And I think it works pretty neatly. Now, when we try and translate this into the IT operating model, I start by focusing on, in the business model, the operating model within the business model, independent of IT, an organization needs information to do their job, to support their activities, to support their processes. Where does the information come from? Partially, it comes from automated information systems by means of IT services that give you access to those systems. And how do those IT systems and services come about? Well, you need an operating model for the IT function. So you've got IT processes, IT organization, even IT information that IT needs to do its job, IT suppliers. And referring top left there, you can see to a almost illegible white paper, an IT for IT white paper defining the IT operating model, which I wrote together with Andrew Campbell, the author of Operating Model Canvas, and Mike Fulton, who's a member of the IT for IT forum. And we were quite pleased with that paper because it defines how we think about an IT operating model. It sort of puts a stake in the ground that people can discuss what is an IT operating model. I'd certainly recommend you taking a look at that if you're interested in these models. Now, this could be, you could see this as there's a separate IT department separate to the business, the lines of business that use IT. That could be the case. And in those cases, we often talk about business and IT alignment, where you align the IT function and the business functions. But it could equally apply to, and this, you come across this more often in organizations that depend more heavily on technology, where the IT function is integrated into the line of business, and where we talk about business and IT convergence, where both IT people and business people are reporting to the same management line, and where it's actually debatable whether people are providing service to each other or just collaborating. But that's another topic completely. So this is giving you the business model, the operating model, and the IT operating model. I'm going to focus on the IT operating model from now on, and illustrate a couple of things I think are worth illustrating. Starting with service, the phenomenon of service, and this could be a webinar in its own right. It's that crazy interaction, usually between people. Crazy because it's to do with people, so it's unpredictable. You simply don't know what's going to happen between people, and its service is about economic exchange, usually voluntary economic exchange, and it's where service providers and service recipients apply their resources, apply their skills, apply their knowledge. Both parties, not only the provider, the service consumer has an active role to play in co-creating. I've emphasized contextually experienced value. Contextually, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's about the service. The experience is individual, it's subjective, and it changes all the time. If you deal with a service as a service consumer, if you deal with a service provider for the first time, you'll be unsure about how they work, the procedures they follow. So you need more information. Whereas the second or the fifth or the 10th time you work with them, you know how they work. You don't need an information. You get a different experience, and your expectations have been formed by the 9 previous experiences. So it does. It's a very unpredictable thing, and we simply have to recognize the unpredictability of service. So we've got an interaction between two parties where trust is absolutely crucial, but also the power balance. You know, who's got the most power? Is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? That's an important part of the interaction as well. Now, the interaction will have an effect on both organizations. It will affect change. Change of what? Change of usually resources. Think about financial resources. The provider's resources, financial resources will usually increase. The consumer's resources will be depleted. when money is exchanged. Both organizations acquire more knowledge, which you could say is a resource. And if I were to paint your house, for instance, your asset or resource, the house, would increase in value after I painted it. So there will be change to your organization as a result of the service interaction, and it might affect other things. The relationship would change, possibly your values would change, but that would be a long-term indirect result. Constraints possibly in the organization. Things will change. Things will change in the organization. That's a major point. But then it's really the key belief, as far as I'm concerned, thinking about the decision making that goes into either engaging with a service provider, and then how you engage with the service provider, the decision making that goes on about that, realizing that decisions are 99% emotional. Your prefrontal cortex tends to intervene when people have homicidal tendencies. So, not going to do that despite the emotions. But in general, decisions are emotional, but we post-rationalize them. We come up with stories to explain why we needed that new car or whatever. So, because we're meaning-seeking beings, that's simply how people are. So you come up with stories to rationalize things. But it's very much emotional. So it depends how you feel about things. That will influence your future decision-making. Final part about this in this exploration is the concept that your emotions will be influenced both by the interaction. When I come to paint your house, if I smoke, you probably won't appreciate it. I wouldn't, by the way. I wouldn't paint your house either. It would be a disaster. But the process will influence will influence your emotions, and the effect of the service on your organization will also affect your emotions and therefore your future decision making. And that's that contextually experienced value that I'm talking about. So I hope you got something out of that. That's one of the things I wanted to share. Second one is value streams, moving on to the IT processes and value chains, as Andrew Campbell calls them. I call them value streams. And thinking about value streams in the context of IT, we often start a value stream with requirements. Something needs to be done. So something is developed that results in code. The code is deployed to operations. You've got an operational system. The system is people given access to the system via IT service so they can use the system. The message to share here is that there's a prequel and a sequel to this value stream, and it's possibly broader than you think. Before you come up with requirements, somebody has thought up an idea, and a brilliant idea has occurred to somebody. And when they've thought about it a few times and shared it with a couple of colleagues, they say, yeah, that seems like a plausible hypothesis. If we invest $1 million, it's going to generate $500,000 a year in revenue or in savings, whatever. But let's say it's got the potential to generate $500,000 revenue a year, this investment. So let's go for it. And we come up with requirements that get developed and deployed. The realization is that value is determined by innovation and marketing. I think it was Peter Drucker that said that. He said, that's where the value is created. Everything after that is just cost. This is where you determine it's going to generate the value $500,000 a year. The only thing that happens after that is value leakage. Things can go wrong. The famous Dutch scientist, computer scientist, Dijkstra, who won the Turing Prize, I think in the 80s or the 90s, he said, computing's core challenge is how not to make a mess of it. A fabulous quote. I think it's probably still true. This is where, it's delayed or it goes wrong and you have to do it again. There's no value added to that $500,000 a year. It can only go downhill after there. Bit of a sobering thought. Now, not only do we have a prequel, we also have a sequel. And that's where the IT services are used people get information from the information systems, hopefully use the information. If they understand the functionality, if they interpret the information correctly, the data correctly, they take better decisions because they have more information. It goes back to information theory and Claude Shannon, I believe. That's the function of information. It helps you take, reduces uncertainty, helps you take better decisions. But it's only when somebody acts on a decision that's been improved by information that they got, by the way, out of that information system that we make such a fuss about, that value is actually realized. And who cares about that? Does the IT department care about how effectively the users use the systems? That is often the weakest link. So that's that co-creation of value part. So that's a key point to realize there. And it's also somewhere, a place where value can be leaked. So that's something to think about, the scope of your value stream. That's the major point here. Going back to the book, Andrew Campbell, author of the book, suggested that you should start with your value propositions, what you actually produce, what are your IT value propositions, your IT services, and how many value streams should you have? You probably have different value streams for different types of value propositions. And then you can ask yourself, are there steps in different value streams that could be combined? If you look at the diagram here, you can see color coding that indicates, can things be combined? For instance, in a shared service center, should there be steps standardized, not centralized, but standardized in decentralized value streams? Which steps should be managed in their own right independently of other value streams? Which steps give you a source of advantage, which problematic or contain opportunities that you could develop? So it's a pretty neat way of thinking about value streams in terms of steps and what to decentralize, what to centralize. Looking very briefly at high velocity IT, we suggest that you take a look at the nature of the systems that you're dealing with, and they will vary from system to system, and that you decide which approaches are most effective. That's the basic message there. And we refer to lean, agile, resilient, and continuous approaches. Just touching on these at a very high level to make you aware of the topic. And if you're interested, you can dive into the book. This is another key topic. I mentioned it at the start. People are struggling with teams. And in particular, what's the scope of the teams? What size should they be? How much autonomy should you give teams? The persistence, should they be temporary or more permanent constructs? Persistence. Should you have dedicated resources, or should you share people across teams? Is there enough workload to justify having a specialized role in the team, for instance? Or do you need more workload? Think about not only the amount of work, but the cognitive load that it puts on people. People can only take a certain amount of intellectual challenge. Think about cognitive load. Think about information exchange as well between teams. I'd like to develop that very briefly. Thinking about the number of teams that you have and the communication, firstly between teams. On this chart, if you've got few teams on the left-hand side, then there won't be much communication effort between teams because you don't have many teams. On the right-hand side, you've got lots of teams, so you'll have lots of communication effort, probably exponentially rising. If you think about the communication effort within teams, the bigger the team on the left-hand side, the more communication effort you'll have within a team. Whereas if you've got very small teams with fewer people, the blue line will be on the right-hand side is much lower. Combine the two, you've got the cumulative communication effort, and the idea is you want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want too few teams, you don't want too many. That's the idea. That's the joy of a U curve. You just avoid the extremes. But this is really a key topic that people are struggling with. Look at I mentioned the book Project to Product, Mick Kirsten. Team Topologies is an excellent book. Skelton and Pais, Nigel Thurlow, Charlie Betts, John Cutler, Don Reinertson, all very bright people who have opinions about this topic. Right. Chapter 3, one of my favorite chapters. I defined 5 key behavior patterns. In hindsight, I should have called them aspirations, things that people aspire to, what motivates people. And particularly now people are more mobile in their job choices, what constitutes meaningful and rewarding work. Things like being trusted in the workplace, psychological safety, doing the ethically right thing, for instance. So think about what motivates people. Second part of chapter 3, various models and concepts that mainly influence ways of thinking. And I'm going to pick two of these. First one is working in complex environments. But I'd like to do our final poll now, Mitch, to think about the characteristics of your work mainly. What characterizes your work? Is it, firstly, mostly about characterizing situations and applying predetermined best practice, which is about situations where things are mostly known? Is it about analyzing a situation, a knowable situation where information can be found, and when you found the information, deciding what to do? Is it more about the unknowable, where you have to experiment to find out what works? Or are you mostly stabilizing volatile situations which are completely novel? So what's the best typology of your work?
Like they're coming in, we're at about 50%. Keep them coming, keep it open for another couple seconds. Just a quick comment as people are contributing to the poll, just please don't forget to complete the event survey. I provided a link in the chat. We're about 70%, 1 or 2 more seconds. Give you a chance to add your response.
I haven't done this one as often as I've done the poll number 2, but I do have some experience with this.
Mark, I think we're at a good number, 80%.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
in the poll.
Yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, similar kind of pattern. In the past, it's mostly been about 2 and 3. They've been the predominant, the major ones. This is fairly high on stabilizing volatile situations. That's an interesting one. Might reflect the seniority of the participants. Usually it's managers. Usually the higher the manager, the more events they have to deal with, like politicians.
Go ahead, stop sharing, or?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, that's great. So that's good. Right. Very briefly, I'm going to introduce you to a framework, the framework that changed my professional thinking, private thinking as well, personal thinking as well a bit, the most. The Cynefin sense-making framework, which is really an eye-opener for me. I found it liberating. It's a framework that helps you look at organizations through a different lens in terms of their predictability. With on the right-hand side, an ordered system environment that you're working in, where things are either clear, obvious, or where things are knowable if you analyze them enough. But things are predictable. Whereas on the left-hand side, things are less predictable. And I'll illustrate it with using the pandemic to 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when the pandemic emerged, completely surprised most people. It was a novel occurrence. We could have expected it, but we didn't. It was a novel occurrence. And you saw world leaders trying to reassure, well, on the one hand, telling people there was something to worry about, but then saying, you don't have to worry too much because we've got it under control, which of course they hadn't. But they were buying time in order to find out what on earth to do. So that's an example of the chaotic domain. What? Have to react immediately, stabilize the situation. Complete opposite is the clear domain. Obvious, is if then else. It's like turning up to get tested or vaccinated. You follow a procedure. There's not much analysis done. You just follow the steps and it gets done. That's not the case when developing a vaccine, creating a vaccine. But creating a vaccine, I think, is rocket science. It's a question of doing the hard work, doing the analysis. You will find the information. The information is there to be found. You will find it in the end. Aha, you have found the solution. You expect to find the solution. And then that's done. That's not the case in the complex domain, which I think is a great example of a complex domain, is balancing what you've seen over the past 2 years, balancing health, liberty, and the economy, and trying to work out what on earth to do. Because you have no idea, until you have done a lockdown, you have no idea how people will react to a lockdown. You have no idea how they'll react to a fifth lockdown, because things simply change. So you see people experimenting. And it's a great metaphor that I stole from Dave Snowden, the guy behind the Cynefin framework. The bramble bush here, you can't deconstruct a bramble bush and reconstruct it in exactly the same position. And it's the same with organizations. It's like raising a child. If you sent your child to the wrong school, you can't undo it. You have to move on from there. And it's the same with organizations. Once you've made an intervention, you can't remove it. You have to move on. So that's the complex domain. And finally, the domain in the middle, you simply don't know what to do. And you don't know where you are. And that is often the case. The power of this framework for me was it helped me identify in what kind of a domain am I, and therefore what kind of approach is appropriate. Right. And you'll recognize the poll that we just did. The choices that you had, we saw mainly 2 and 3. That's a frequent, in our kind of service work, knowledge work, organizations tend to oscillate between complicated and complex. That's a familiar pattern. This brings a serious management challenge to organizations, because traditional ways of managing, where you use specialization, processes, targets, they all assume a fairly low-level predictability of things. Whereas social service work and knowledge work, it's messy. That needs different approaches. That needs autonomy. That needs scaffolding to guide people, guardrails, which they can ignore if they have can exercise their professional judgment, if they have enough experience. And informal networks, underrated phenomenon, informal networks, think about that. And utilizing values of people. And that's the final point I'd like to touch on. Again, using a U curve, but the other way around, thinking about the effectiveness of the diversity of values in your teams. On the one hand, if everybody thinks the same way, you'll get groupthink, which is not very effective. On the other hand, if there's a great diversity of values in a team, if people are arguing all day long, that's not very effective either. So you need something which I like to call a coherent diversity, where you can have healthy dissent between, healthy discussions with people, challenging each other and getting the most value out of each other's values, assuming that there's enough psychological safety that people don't feel that they have to leave their values at the door when they come to work. So that's that. Chapter 4, biggest chapter in the book. For me, the least exciting part. It comprises 25 practices, we call them techniques, which you could take a look at, see if they apply to your organization. Pick a couple of these. And finally, the statement about the book. If you're struggling with digital, and if you're willing and able to reconstruct your way of thinking, then this book is a great place to start your thinking, but at the same time, a terrible place to stop, because it just gives you some things to think about. Summing up, a couple of bonus sheets. This is a cheat sheet for high velocity IT and how it fits in with the operating model, so you can see its contribution to the IT operating model. Summing up, very conscious of the time, we spoke about 4 drivers. We spoke about, in the first poll, where your value from technology comes. We spoke about the false dichotomy in trends that you often come across. the priorities, your weakest link, highest improvement priority, the concept of the business model, operating model, IT operating model, service, value streams, teams, really tricky topic, teams, the most fundamental of all of these topics, complexity, and finally the diversity of values. So with that, Mitch, I think we are going to stop, and I fear that the question and answer will have to be done by correspondence.
Yeah, so Mark, we received one question, and I
Okay.
sent a message
Yeah.
about getting back to them about the question. So yeah, I know, Mark, I know you got to run. Thank you so much. This concludes our presentation. Please take a moment to complete the exit survey. I put that in link. When the presentation concludes and we end the webinar, you will receive another link to a survey. The survey is to help us understand what high velocity topics you want to hear more about. So please take a moment to fill that out as well. The session was recording.
Just a
Go ahead,
final word of thanks from my part. Excuse my absence. It's Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, and I'm just about to observe 2-minute silence. Thanks very much.
We appreciate your time, Mark. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Thanks everyone for being here today. As I mentioned, the recording, chat transcripts, and other resources will be available to you within 5 business days on the EDUCAUSE ITSM website. Thank you so much, and have a great May ITIL 4 or May 4th day. Take care, everyone.